Welcome to Radio US. In recent weeks, former President Donald Trump has stirred significant controversy with his remarks on foreign policy, particularly regarding Russia and Ukraine. His suggestion of a ceasefire with Russia, which would preclude Ukraine's NATO membership, has sparked heated debates among both US policymakers and international leaders. This shift in rhetoric represents a dramatic pivot from the more traditional stance taken by the United States in the years leading up to his presidency, as well as his foreign policy during his time in office. In a Trump news conference held on February 12, 2025, Trump proposed that a negotiated ceasefire with Russia could help resolve the ongoing war in Ukraine, but at the cost of denying Ukraine's membership in NATO, a position that has been a cornerstone of US foreign policy for decades. He further suggested that territorial concessions might be necessary, essentially acknowledging that Ukraine might have to cede parts of its territory to Moscow in order to secure peace. While Trump's ideas have been framed as an attempt to de-escalate tensions and bring about peace, they have raised alarm bells in Europe and among NATO members, who view such suggestions as undermining the integrity and security of the alliance. The Trump news conference highlighted these remarks as part of his broader argument that the US should not be embroiled in conflicts that do not directly benefit its interests. Trump has long advocated for a foreign policy based on what he terms America First, which prioritizes national interests above international obligations. This policy, which Trump has repeatedly defended throughout his political career, posits that the US should avoid military entanglements unless there is a clear and direct benefit to American security. Trump's stance on Ukraine and NATO is seen by many as part of his broader view that the US has been overcommitted to international alliances, and that these commitments have often resulted in burdensome costs with little tangible benefit to the American public. In the Trump news conference, he reiterated his belief that NATO members, particularly those in Europe, have relied too heavily on the US for their security and have failed to adequately contribute to the alliance's funding. This, Trump argued, had led to an unsustainable situation where the US bore the lion's share of NATO's financial and military obligations, a dynamic he sought to change during his presidency and has continued to push after leaving office. However, Trump's suggestion of a ceasefire and territorial concessions to Russia has raised concerns in Europe, particularly among NATO members. For countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, and Poland, the idea of conceding territory to Russia is seen as a grave threat to European security. The message that a negotiated peace with Russia could involve Ukraine's territorial compromise undermines the very principles that NATO was founded on: collective defense and territorial integrity. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine's bid for NATO membership, strongly criticized Trump's position. Johnson argued that such a policy would embolden Russia and set a dangerous precedent for other authoritarian regimes around the world. Similarly, French President Emmanuel Macron echoed concerns about the potential consequences of appeasing Russia, warning that such a move could destabilize the entire European security architecture. In the Trump news conference, Trump argued that the US should not sacrifice its own interests to protect other countries, especially if these countries were unwilling to uphold their end of the bargain within NATO. This rhetoric plays into Trump's broader nationalist and isolationist worldview, which prioritizes American sovereignty over global commitments. His suggestion that Ukraine's NATO membership should be off the table in exchange for peace with Russia has drawn comparisons to his previous calls for the US to withdraw from international agreements that he deemed unfair or unfavorable to American interests. Trump's position on NATO has always been one of skepticism, questioning the value of the alliance and its role in securing American interests abroad. By suggesting that Ukraine should forego NATO membership, Trump is once again positioning himself as an advocate for a reduced U.S. role in global conflicts and alliances, which has become a hallmark of his foreign policy stance. The potential implications of Trump's position extend far beyond Ukraine and Russia. If his suggested approach were to gain traction, it could signal a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy, one that places more emphasis on national interest and less on collective security arrangements like NATO. This shift could weaken the unity of NATO and embolden Russia to continue its expansionist ambitions in Eastern Europe. Furthermore, Trump's proposal to accept territorial concessions from Ukraine could undermine international law, particularly the principle of territorial integrity, which has been a cornerstone of the post-World War II international order. The notion that a nation might be forced to cede territory in exchange for peace sets a dangerous precedent that could have global ramifications, particularly in regions like the South China Sea or the Korean Peninsula, where territorial disputes are ongoing. In response to Trump's comments, many in the U.S. political establishment, as well as leaders from Europe, have expressed alarm. President Joe Biden, who has consistently supported Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership, has pushed back against Trump's position, warning that abandoning Ukraine would not only embolden Russia, but also send a message to other countries that the U.S. might not honor its security commitments. This has placed Biden in a delicate position, as he seeks to maintain NATO's unity while navigating the increasing pressure from Trump and his supporters, who argue that the U.S. needs to focus more on domestic issues than international commitments. In the Trump news conference, Trump framed his position as an effort to protect American resources and prevent the U.S. from being dragged into conflicts that were not directly aligned with its strategic interests. This rhetoric has found resonance among a significant portion of the American electorate, particularly those who believe that the U.S. has been overcommitted to international obligations at the expense of its domestic priorities. One of the central concerns about Trump's proposed ceasefire with Russia and territorial concessions to Moscow is the long-term strategic consequences. Many foreign policy experts argue that such a policy would not bring lasting peace, but would rather empower Russia to continue its aggressive behavior unchecked. By rewarding Russia's territorial gains, Trump's approach could signal to the world that territorial conquest is an acceptable means of achieving political objectives. This would not only undermine international law, but also destabilize regions where authoritarian regimes might be encouraged to follow Russia's example. The Trump news conference did not address these long-term implications in great detail, focusing instead on the immediate economic and military costs associated with continued U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. However, critics argue that the short-term benefits of disengaging from conflicts, like the one in Ukraine, may not outweigh the long-term costs, both in terms of global stability and the credibility of the U.S. as a guarantor of security in Europe and beyond. In conclusion, Donald Trump's remarks during the Trump news conference have sparked a wide-ranging debate on the future of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in relation to NATO, Russia, and Ukraine. His proposal for a ceasefire and territorial concessions has raised serious concerns among NATO members and U.S. allies, who fear that such a policy could undermine the security of Europe and embolden Russia. While Trump continues to argue that his approach is grounded in protecting American interests, the broader implications of his foreign policy stance could have far-reaching consequences for global security and the stability of international alliances. The Trump news conference has once again placed Trump at the center of the debate over America's role in the world, with his call for a more isolationist foreign policy, challenging the long-standing principles that have guided U.S. foreign relations for decades. Whether this position will gain traction in future U.S. policy remains to be seen, but it is clear that Trump's stance on Russia and NATO will continue to shape the conversation surrounding American foreign policy in the years to come.